What is happening right now in Libya makes us think about how much the world has changed over the past 2 decades. 19 years ago in the United States there was a terrorist attack, also referred to as 9/11. It does not make sense to recall the details of this incident, but it is worth remembering what followed the terrorist attack. In fact, the United States launched a war in 2 theaters of operations at once, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, we will not begin to indicate the number of troops involved in these operations, and how much it cost the American taxpayer, just specify one moment. U.S. troops quickly took control of Iraq and Afghanistan, but very quickly came to the conclusion that the main instigators of these events could not be captured by army operations. They just disappeared into the crowd. Their tracks were allegedly found in Iraq, then in Afghanistan, then in Pakistan, and in the end, Osama was liquidated by a platoon of U.S. Special Forces. Other al-Qaeda figures were also destroyed by targeted attacks, without the use of hundreds of thousands of troops and everything else. Moreover, all this happened years after the attack itself. Osama bin Laden was killed by Special Forces in 2011, 10 years after the terrorist attack. This was due to the fact that it was very difficult to find, and all the capabilities of the United States were connected to his searches. To capture or destroy Osama bin Laden did not spare money and effort, and still, it took 10 long years to succeed. All these years of efforts have been justified by the fact that it is very difficult to find terrorists, as well as the channels of their communications, supplies and other things. It follows that if all this information was available, then the terrorist network would be destroyed much earlier. Roughly the same situation happened with the infamous Islamic State and its leader al-Baghdadi. The story of this elusive Joe, although it lasted less than 10 years, has also turned into an epic battle with a spy story. And again, explanations came into play in terms of the fact that the Islamic State is difficult to fight, since its leadership strictly adheres to the rules of secrecy. And again, in the background there is a formula according to which everything could be finished quickly and clearly, if the terrorists didn't hide in such an ingenious way. Logic suggests that it is so, if not for Libya. Surprisingly, the events in this country, in fact, being a cast from previous epics, in the end turned out to be their antipode in terms of conspiracy, covering and confusing traces. Everything happens completely openly. The initiator of the armed struggle against the legitimate government of Libya does not even hide himself. Even in Ukraine, he is making clumsy attempts to disguise his participation in the war, but there is no veil here. Everything is done before the eyes of the world community. But what's most interesting in the Libyan epic is the autopsy of all the mechanisms that work in the Islamic State and worked in al-Qaeda. That is, everything is in plain sight, and if you use the formula about the complexity of the fight against terrorism, which was featured in the epic with the elimination of Osama and Baghdadi, then you don't need to look for anything. Everything is in plain sight, and then the same logic says that everything should be nipped almost instantly. However, this does not happen. Russia is evacuating from Libya the fighters of the Russian private military company Wagner, sent to the country to support the army of Marshal Khalifa Haftar, who has been waging a war for oil resources for more than 3 years with the UN-recognized government of national consent in Tripoli. Hundreds of mercenaries sent to Libya along with military equipment and advisors left the front line in the west of the country in the direction of the city of Bani Walid, from where they were taken out by plane in an unknown direction, reports Al Jazeera. According to them, 3 and 32 cargo planes landed at Bani Walid airport to pick up about 1,500 Wagner soldiers. The mayor of Bani Walid, Salim Alaban, told Anadolu that the planes with the Russian mercenaries left the country. But this is also confirmed by our sources, which draw information directly from the inhabitants of Bani Walid, who observe all these movements and give approximate quantitative characteristics. For example, they write about the number of units of equipment of the Russians on which they enter the city, the approximate amount of manpower and the number of flights of aircraft that take out mercenaries. It should be noted that local residents clearly distinguish between Russian mercenaries and mercenaries from other African and Arab countries. They distinguish between Americans and Europeans in the same way that we distinguish between Chinese. One glance is enough to understand that these are Wagner soldiers. True, among the Europeans there were also Frenchmen, but their number is scanty and therefore they go into the field of statistical error. So it's not difficult to calculate the number of Wagner soldiers there. Sources claim that their number is over 1,500 inches and closer to 1,700 people. In addition, as of Monday evening, more than 50 cargo planes with mercenaries from Wagner, or, more precisely, 52 flights, left the Bani Walid airfield. It is clear that these are not 50 separate planes, but several airplanes that make shuttle flights. Fortunately, a one-way flight is a little more than 300 kilometers and takes less than an hour. That is, on one circle, 3 hours, not more, taking into account loading and unloading. Plus, large-scale wheeled vehicles, the same Panzer air defense, for example, left the city on their own. It is not difficult to assume that this is a few dozen or even a couple of hundred people, since we are talking about the crews and the military guard of the convoy. Total, according to the most conservative estimates, there are already about 2,000 mercenaries from the private military company Wagner. In addition, just this morning there was a message that 2 transport planes arrived at the Bonny Valid airfield and a new convoy rolled in immediately, the personnel of which immediately began to load on the planes. And this suggests that not all mercenaries from Wagner have left Tarhuna and the suburbs of Tripoli. Most likely, while these lines are being written, data appeared on new convoys of Wagner soldiers and aircraft flights. This is not surprising, since the Turkish military gave time until 10 p.m. on May 27 to evacuate them from Tripoli and Tarhuna. As far as we know, the Russians were given a guarantee of the security of the passage of columns in the direction from Tripoli and Tarhuna with a warning about the immediate destruction of everything that tries to move in the opposite direction. But what happens at this moment? Only near Tripoli and in the Tarhuna area stood 1 brigade of Wagner soldiers, but they still stand in the east of Libya, in Sudan, the Central African Republic. 2 battalions were in Mozambique, and they have not gone anywhere from Syria. Well, what happens? Division? As the retreating column showed, PMCs are armed with barreled and rocket artillery, the Panzer air defense system, armored vehicles, including tanks, albeit not new ones, armored personnel carriers and fairly fresh Tiger armored vehicles, which Gaddafi didn't buy. Now let's look at the global practice of using PMCs. Armed groups of such companies always play the role of a defender. Simply put, there is simply protection of some objects, there is armed protection and there is paramilitary security, but always security. In Iraq, American troops were active in offensive operations, and PMCs guarded critical infrastructure. It is hard to imagine that the Marines are attacking, and the flanks cover them with PMCs. It is even more difficult to imagine that PMCs are attacking instead of the Marines, and this is the case in Ukraine, Syria and Libya. PMC Wagner is conducting an offensive war. Moreover, they are generally not adapted to the protection and defense of at least something. As we see, they could not withstand the attack on their positions either in Al-Baytaya, or in the suburbs of Tripoli, or in Tarhun. In the same way, they flee in Syria under the blows of Turkish or American troops. That is, they are simply unable to conduct defensive military operations in principle. Conversely, PMC's Wagner always work as an attacking and exciting side. Moreover, precisely for this they need all the weapons that we saw during their retreat. But after all, the IG acts in approximately the same vein. They avoid defensive battles and in the event of an enemy attack, try to disperse and retreat. True, they have almost no heavy weapons other than trophy weapons and therefore dispersal there is more effective. Wagner simply can't abandon their Panzer air defense missile systems. Although they managed to do this, it follows that, in fact, the Wagner Group is not a classic PMC simply by the nature of its actions. These are mercenaries who do not fall under the conventions prescribing the rules of warfare. They do not adhere to the requirements of these conventions. Behind them is a bloody train of war crimes. Moreover, even Russian legislation does not provide for the existence of such structures. In this case, Wagner is an illegal organization from the point of view of international law and the legislation of the Russian Federation. Simply put, this is a terrorist armed group already on an international scale, on the account of which a number of war crimes in Ukraine, Syria and Libya. And one more thing, Wagner evacuation is carried out by Russian aircraft, and in numerous photos this is already clearly visible. That is, Wagner PMCs are fighting with heavy weapons of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and now we first saw how they are evacuated by military transport aircraft of the Russian Federation. All this together suggests that the Russian government did not just put its signature on the Wagner terrorist organization, which is a general military division, at least, but put so many of these signatures that there simply was no room left for something else. And the cherry on the cake is the information that with the beginning of the retreat of PMC Wagner, in the south of Libya in the desert areas the group's already forgotten ISIS began to operate. That is, while the Haftars and Wagners were advancing, no ISIS was even heard and vice versa. Here they are. That is, Wagner and ISIS coordinate their actions, and this can only happen if their actions are coordinated from one place and if they eat from the same pan. Total the Russian Federation, in Libya, coordinates the actions of two terrorist organizations at once and points to the Center for the Coordination of Terrorism, the city of Moscow. No one needs to be searched. No agents and wiretaps are needed. Just look at what is happening in Libya, and draw conclusions that the Russian Federation is the center of international terrorism, and then the conclusions and actions. If there is neither one nor the other, the question arises as to why, due to the suppression of terrorism, a fight broke out in Iraq, Afghanistan and Syria, and why is the even larger scale terrorism emanating from Moscow completely ignored? Although the consequences, in terms of victims and destabilization of the international order, Moscow brings a lot more and immediately in many directions. Is it that the world has changed so quickly, or are there any other motives? After all, Moscow does not even need to be blamed for this. She shows herself so brightly that even a blind person will notice it. In this regard, the position of the United States, which so violently reacted to other manifestations of terrorism, is not clear. Also surprising is the position of Europe. The quasi-isolationism that it has been demonstrating lately will not protect it from the effects of large-scale terrorism, in the form of millions of refugees who have already swept Europe, or from direct terrorist attacks that have already occurred over the past few years. Both Washington and Brussels should understand that while they are blowing bubbles from the nose, the Moscow Terrorist International is strengthening its ties, polishing methods and, as already understood, has fully integrated with Islamic terrorist movements that coordinate their actions with the Russian military and terrorist mercenaries. In general, everything that is happening in Libya shows the essence of Moscow better than anything before. In Libya, there is no Russian-speaking population that they allegedly defend. There is no joint border through which the fascists can get to them. They were not invited there by the official government of Libya, as in Syria. They just came there with weapons to take away what they want. However, as in other places, and no evolution is evident, the gangster state, not meeting with resistance, is acting more openly and is no longer looking for special cover for its piracy. And all this is terrorism. Or is it another terrorism, not like Al-Qaeda? That is, in the concept of the fight against terrorism, an obvious internal contradiction has appeared. If terrorism must be fought, then here it is, fight. If you do not fight terrorism, then in this case you need to change its definition so that all this beauty does not fall under its definition. But then why did Osama and Baghdadi be killed?